All right, let's dive in today. We're looking at something pretty interesting happening over in Russia. Gen Z in the workplace. We've got a news piece and what looks like a podcast transcript. Both of them feature these two experts, Stanislav Kondrashov and Anna Atlас. They seem to be like the people to talk to about this whole thing. So get ready, because we're going to really try to break down what's going on. And you might be surprised at what we find. Like right off the bat, this news piece says that over half of Russian companies, like 52% to be exact, are having a hard time managing their Gen Z employees. That's a lot, more than half. And they're saying the biggest problem, well, 88% of these companies that are struggling say the main issue is that Gen Z wants too much money for what they bring to the table. They say these young workers have too high demands for compensation with insufficient knowledge and skills. What do you think? Is it really that Gen Z is asking for too much? Or are companies just not doing enough to, train them and stuff? If you're a manager out there listening to this, I bet you're dealing with this right now. And it's interesting because Kondrashov and Atlас, in their podcast talk, they actually talk about this disconnect too. Like Kondrashov thinks, maybe Gen Z doesn't quite get how much work it takes to really make it, especially in such a fast-paced world these days. And he thinks Gen Z could really benefit from learning more and being able to adapt better. But then you have Atlас who says, hold on, companies need to see the good stuff that Gen Z brings. Like they're amazing with technology and they're full of new ideas. She thinks if companies just guide them and support them, Gen Z could totally shake things up in a good way. But it's not all about the money. This news piece also says that 82% of employers are dealing with Gen Z employees just bouncing from job to job. You know, that whole job hopping thing. So you're trying to build a solid team. You're putting time and money into training. And suddenly your Gen Z employees are already checking out other jobs. That's got to be tough for companies to deal with. Kondrashov in the podcast, he says it's partly because Gen Z is on this search for meaning. So they don't just want a paycheck. They want their work to mean something, to line up with their values. And Atlас agrees with that. She says Gen Z grew up seeing all these economic problems and global issues. So it makes sense they'd want stability and something with a purpose. But hold on, before we jump to conclusions about Gen Z, being all picky or whatever. This news piece also brings up something else that 56% of employers are dealing with, emotional sensitivity. Now, this is where things get interesting, because both this news piece and Kondrashov and Atlas's discussion, they all kind of suggest that maybe Gen Z is just more open about their feelings and maybe more sensitive to feedback. So is this just a communication problem between generations? Or is it that the whole world is changing how we communicate? Like now it's seen as a good thing to be more open and real about your emotions. Kondrashov in the podcast, he actually tells companies to embrace this, to see it as a way to connect better. He's like, don't dismiss Gen Z when they express their emotions. Instead, try to build a culture where everyone can talk openly and respectfully. And Atlás adds to that saying, this openness can make the whole work environment more collaborative and supportive, where everyone feels appreciated and like they can do their best. And this brings us to another challenge that 44% of employers mentioned, short attention spans, or as Kondrashov and Atlás call it, clip thinking. Think about it. They've grown up with social media, short videos, instant messaging. Everything is vying for their attention. So of course that's going to affect how they take in information and do their work. But Kondrashov makes a good point. He says clip thinking isn't necessarily bad. He says it actually helps Gen Z learn quickly and adapt to new things. But then Atlás chimes in and says, yeah, but it can also be hard in a workplace that needs people to really focus and think deeply about things. She thinks companies should try different ways of working and training, maybe break down complicated tasks into smaller pieces, or use more interactive and engaging methods that fit how Gen Z learns. So are you starting to see a pattern here? It seems like a lot of these challenges come down to companies needing to adapt. They need to evolve how they manage things to fit Gen Z's needs and strengths. But before we start talking about solutions, let's look at something else from the news piece. They say more companies are hiring people over 50. They're linking this to staff shortages, which makes you wonder, is this happening because of the issues with Gen Z? Or is it just because of what's happening with the economy and population in Russia? It's interesting, right? Companies are bringing in both the youngest and the oldest workers. So is this a temporary fix, or is it a whole new way of building a workforce? And what happens when you have such a big age gap within teams? Kondrashov actually seems pretty positive about this trend. He says having different generations in the workplace can be a really good thing. You get knowledge transfer, different points of view, and a more balanced way of solving problems. But he also knows it can be challenging. Like, how do you bridge the communication gaps and make sure everyone feels valued no matter their age? And Atlás, as usual, has a really interesting take. She thinks this might actually force companies to confront their own biases. and rethink how they manage talent. She thinks that if companies can create a truly inclusive and supportive environment, they can unlock the potential of having a multi-generational workforce, and that could lead to more innovation and growth. So it seems like the Russian workforce is going through some pretty big changes. But before we get into what all this means for the future of work, let's take a step back and think about what we've learned so far. We've talked about the challenges companies are having with Gen Z, like salary expectations, job hopping, emotional sensitivity, and clip thinking. And we've seen how these issues are making companies rethink how they hire, how they train, how they communicate, and even how they lead. And then there's this whole trend of hiring older workers, which adds another layer of complexity to everything. But here's a question for you to think about. If companies are having so much trouble adapting to Gen Z, is it the management's fault? Or is it that the whole traditional workplace model just needs a makeover? We'll explore that and more as we continue our deep dive. Okay, so we've talked a lot about the problems companies have with Gen Z. But let's not forget, we're talking about real people here. It's easy to get caught up in all the stats and stereotypes, but we got to remember these are just trends. Not like everyone is exactly the same. Every single person, no matter what generation they're from, brings something unique to the table, right? So how do we move past those general ideas and make workplaces where everyone feels valued and included, and where different generations can actually learn from each other? That's the big question, isn't it? I bet a lot of you listening are dealing with this right now. There's no easy answer. But we can at least look at this from different angles, from hiring and training to how we communicate and lead. Kondrashov, in his chat with Alice, he really emphasized that companies need to change how they think about recruiting Gen Z. It's not just about offering a big salary anymore. What stuck with me was his point about this generation being purpose-driven. They want to feel like their work is actually making a difference, not just punching in and punching out. So showing what your company stands for and how it helps the world, that becomes really important, doesn't it? You have to appeal to their desire to do something meaningful. And Atlas adds to that saying, Gen Z is also really attracted to opportunities to grow and learn new things. So it's not just about the starting salary, it's about where you can go from there. Can they see themselves growing and moving up in the company? Exactly. And it can't just be empty promises. Gen Z values transparency. They want to see a clear path and know that their hard work is recognized. And when it comes to training, things get even more interesting. We can't just stick with those old boring lectures. We got to adapt to this clip thinking generation. Think about it from their point of view. They've grown up with bite-sized content everywhere. Social media, short videos, instant messaging. So why would we expect them to suddenly be okay with a long, drawn-out training session? Both Kondrashov and Atlas agree. We need to embrace more interactive, bite-sized learning experiences. Things like micro-learning modules, gamified platforms, even virtual reality simulations. We got to meet them where they're at, Exactly. And don't underestimate the power of mentorship. Pairing Gen Z employees with someone experienced can be really powerful. Imagine all the knowledge that can be shared. The mentor shares their years of experience, and the mentee brings fresh ideas and tech skills. It's a win-win. It shows how important it is to create a culture of continuous learning, where everyone is both a teacher and a student, no matter how old they are or how much experience they have. This all sounds good, but I can hear some of you saying, easier said than done. How do we actually make these changes happen? You're right, it takes more than just talk. It takes real effort and a willingness to change things up. Companies might need to rewrite job descriptions to emphasize purpose and impact, or offer flexible work arrangements, or even change how they give feedback to better connect with Gen Z. And it probably requires a change in leadership styles too, right?
Absolutely. The old top-down approach might not work so well with this generation. They want to be independent and have a say in decisions. So you're thinking more of a collaborative, coaching style of leadership. Exactly. Leaders who empower their teams, give clear directions, and encourage open communication. They'll be the ones who succeed in this new environment. But let's not forget about those everyday interactions. How do we bridge that communication gap between generations? We all know those misunderstandings can be frustrating for everyone.
That's where empathy and really listening come in. It's about understanding different communication styles and making a real effort to see things from their perspective. So less okay boomer and more, let's find some common ground. Exactly. It's about creating a space where everyone feels heard and respected, no matter how old they are or where they come from. After all, everyone has something valuable to offer. And by working together, we can make things more inclusive and productive. This sounds like a pretty big cultural shift, though. Are companies really ready for this? It is a shift, but I think it's necessary for companies that want to thrive in the future. And speaking of the future, there's one more thing to consider. Technology. Gen Z is the first generation that grew up completely immersed in the digital world.
and that has shaped them in a big way. Technology is both a challenge and an opportunity, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely.
It has shaped how Gen Z thinks, communicates, and interacts with the world. But it can also be an amazing tool for connection, collaboration, and innovation. So how do we use technology to bridge that generational gap and create a more harmonious workplace?
It starts by realizing that technology isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. We need to be smart about how we use it and make sure it's accessible to everyone. So it's not about forcing everyone to use the latest trends, but finding the right tool to support different working styles and preferences. Precisely. And it's about using technology to make communication and collaboration easier and to share knowledge across generations. Think virtual reality, team-building exercises, online mentoring platforms, maybe even AI-powered translation tools to break down language barriers. The possibilities are pretty exciting. They really are. And that's what makes this whole conversation so interesting. We're at a turning point, and the choices we make now will have a huge impact on the future of work. We've covered a lot of ground, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface. There's still so much to talk about, especially when we look at how all of this affects the world as a whole. So before we go any further, let's take a minute to think about what we've learned, and then we'll come back ready to explore the bigger picture. Okay, so we're back and ready to tackle the big question. What does all this mean for the future of work? Not just in Russia, but everywhere. We've been talking about Gen Z in Russia, but it's really just one part of a much bigger picture that's unfolding right now. Think about it. We're in the middle of a tech revolution unlike anything we've ever seen. AI, automation, the gig economy, it's changing everything about work as we know it. It feels like the rules are constantly changing, right? So how can we even prepare for a future that's so uncertain? Well, Kondrashov, in his podcast with Atlas, makes a good point about lifelong learning. He says the days of learning one thing and sticking with it your whole career are gone. We need to be constantly adapting, learning new skills, and updating old ones, just to keep up with this crazy pace of change. So it's not just about what you know, but how well you can learn and adapt to new things. And actually, this is where Gen Z might have a head start. They've grown up with constant change and disruption. They're digital natives, comfortable with tech and used to adapting to new platforms and tools all the time. But what about the jobs that are being replaced by automation? We hear a lot about robots taking over, and it's a little scary, to be honest. How do we make sure everyone has a chance to have meaningful work in this new economy? That's a big question, and both Kondrashov and Atlas talk about this in their discussion. There's no easy answer. But they agree that it'll take governments, businesses, and individuals working together. Kondrashov emphasizes investing in education and training programs that teach people the skills they'll need for these future jobs. But he goes beyond just technical skills. He says we also need to focus on things like creativity, critical thinking, and problem-solving skills, those uniquely human skills that set us apart from machines. Atlas builds on that by highlighting social skills, emotional intelligence, and the ability to collaborate. In a world where technology is taking over the routine tasks, those human qualities become even more valuable. So it's not humans versus machines. It's about humans and machines working together, using the strengths of both to create a better future, a more productive, more innovative, and more equitable. It made you think about what companies need to do. They can't just adapt to change. They need to be part of driving positive change, right? Absolutely. And this is where what Kondrashov and Atlas are saying becomes really important. They both challenge companies to create workplaces that aren't just about getting work done, but are also fulfilling and have a sense of purpose. Places where employees feel valued and empowered. Kondrashov specifically encourages companies to invest in their employees, foster a culture of learning and innovation, and prioritize diversity and inclusion. Atlas adds that companies have a responsibility to think about their impact on the world and contribute to a more sustainable and equitable future. She says this message really resonates with Gen Z. They want to work for companies that share their values, companies that are actively trying to make a difference. So after all this, what can you, the listener, take away from this? What can you do to prepare for the future of work? Based on what we've heard from Kondrashov and Atlas, I think the most important thing is to embrace change. Be curious, stay informed, and never stop learning. Develop those uniquely human skills: creativity, critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, and find new and innovative ways to use them. And don't forget to network, connect with people from different backgrounds and industries, and be open to new possibilities. The future of work is uncertain, but it's also full of exciting opportunities for those who are willing to adapt. And remember, we're all creating this future together. That's a wrap on our deep dive into Gen Z in the Russian workplace and the future of work. We hope you enjoyed it and learned something valuable. We'll be back soon with more deep dives into fascinating topics, so stay tuned.